Psychology students, today we are going to be talking about the AP Psychology test, which happens in May and allows colleges to find out how much of the information we are covering in our course that you have retained and whether or not they feel comfortable giving you college credit for this particular class. So this test is made up of two parts. The first part is a multiple choice portion, which has 100 questions that you get 70 minutes for. Most students find that that is enough time. Each of these questions has a question and then 5 choices that you can choose between. And these questions come from all throughout the course. This is the biggest portion of the test because 2/3 of your overall score comes from this portion. So you can actually do pretty well in the test just with multiple choice. The other part is the free response portion, which has 2 FRQs that you get a total of 50 minutes to work on as one 50-minute block for both questions. Each question has 7 parts, and those could be terms you need to apply, or they could be tasks. So 7 in each, or 14 total, and this makes up 1/3 of your overall AP score. So what does this score mean at all? Now, those of you that have taken an AP class before already know that it's scored on a 1 to 5 basis. 4s and 5s are really strong scores, meaning that it's an equivalent of a B or above at a college level. 3s are also considered like a passing score by most colleges, where it's kind of a low B, mid C range equivalency. And colleges will give credit depending on their own policies. Some colleges will give credit for 3 or above. Some will only give credit for 4 or 5. Some colleges only accept 5s. Some don't accept any, but expect that you've taken the test and show that you do well on it for entrance. So there's lots of websites that show what colleges expect, and we will point you in that direction. Let's talk about the multiple choice section. So as I mentioned, these questions come from all throughout the course. And basically, when we look at the different units here, you can see there's percentages next to them. And this is what percentage of the multiple choice comes from each of these units. So we actually started not in order. We started with memory, which is part of unit 5, cognitive psychology, which you can see 13 to 17% of the multiple choice questions will come from that section. So it includes memory, but also things like problem solving and language. So we'll dive into those here in upcoming units. Part 2 is where I really want to spend the most time, the free response question, because this is a little bit different depending on which AP class you're looking at. And this one is for psychology, is very straightforward. So there's 2 FRQs and they're different. So the first one is always a research-based question, where normally you are going to be given an experiment or a study. They're going to describe it to you. And then you have to actually describe different parts of it and piece it together and maybe talk about the ethics. You might be asked to draw a graph or interpret a graph. And when we get to the research methods unit, we'll look at a bunch of these and make sure that everyone feels comfortable in doing this particular task. The second question is a general application FRQ. In this one, you're usually given a scenario and then 7 terms to apply to the scenario. So for example, you could imagine they would say, you are a student at George Washington High School and you are at a pep rally. The band is playing, the students are cheering, and the sports players are carrying a giant trophy. How do each of the following terms apply to the scenario? And they give you some different terms. And for each individual one, you'd have to define what the word was and then talk about how it could exactly fit in that pep rally. How could it be seen at that pep rally? So each of those questions has 7 things you need to do, either 7 terms for question 2, or usually 7 tasks, short tasks, or figuring out what part of the experiment it is for question 1. Now, one thing that's a little bit different than the English or U.S. history sort of questions for AP is that for psychology, each one of these individual points is based on its own merits. So you don't get a certain band of scores based on how well you write. For question 2, if there's 7 terms, each one of those you can either get the point for or not get the point for. There's no points for things like how well you write or whether or not you have a really good introduction or conclusion or you tied it all together. There's 0 points for any of that, so you should not do any of that. You should just dive right into the first bullet point and spit out your answer and make sure you use lots of good examples. And as we mentioned, you get 50 minutes total. And once we get closer to the test, we'll start doing things more with timing as opposed to just with formatting. So it'll look something like this, where you'll have the directions on top, you'll have a little scenario, and then you'll have a bunch of bullet points underneath. And this would be an example for question 2. So we've seen this acronym before, but just to touch base on it real quick here, this idea of chug sodas as a good acronym for what to remember. So being concise when answering the prompt. Spit it out. Make sure your handwriting is legible. Important. Underline the vocabulary terms. That's also very handy for the reader. Getting rid of intro and concluding paragraphs, as we just talked about. So that's kind of the setup. And then sodas gives a little bit more detail here. So leave a space between each paragraph. We'll take a look at that in a minute. And organize each term into its own paragraph. Like I said, we'll look at a picture. Define every term. This is now we're getting into the actual details of what you need to do. Define the term and then apply the concept to the scenario. Define and apply. Define and apply. That is the heart of what we are doing. You need both. And then use synonyms to avoid parodying the prompt. You can't just use the same word that they use always for the vocabulary terms. So when you're actually writing it, you are going to be writing in ink. You're going to be handwriting it. And some of you have now gotten very used to typing, and we're going to do some of our FRQ practice with typing, some of it with handwriting. But please try to write neatly and consider your reader. So things that they like, as we've just mentioned, get to the point. Don't write an introduction and conclusion. Write in simple declarative sentences. Organize it into 7 separate small paragraphs. They're their own little islands. Don't just write it in a big blob. Please, please, please underline those key terms. So what we don't want is for it to look like this, where it's a big blob where almost every word, you can see they're writing so fast that it's almost illegible to the actual human that has to decipher it. Instead, try to write more like this, where you can see that they've got a few ideas and they leave a whole space. An idea, and then they actually left 2 blank lines. The one thing I would add to this is I would underline what the key idea was, the key vocabulary term that they are talking about. So for example, in the second little paragraph, it says the ethical flaw of failing to protect the participants' rights to privacy can be corrected by providing. So in this one, they're talking about how to correct ethical flaws. So they would underline ethical flaws. So the reader would know, oh, this is the part where they're talking about ethical flaws. Now, how are they scoring this? Typically, and we're going to look at some examples of rubrics in class, but they're looking to give you points, not to take away points. So as they're reading it, they have a list of the things that count for points. So sometimes it's saying things in a very specific way, or sometimes you have to do multiple things, like you have to define it and you have to apply it and you have to make sure it's in the right time period and you have to do this. And if you do all those things, they can give you the point. Typically, they are not trying to take away points once you earn them. So keep giving more examples. It's in your best interest to write more rather than to write less, because sometimes you need enough stuff so they can give you the point, and once you've done it, you're good. Also, it's very helpful for you to write in order, because as we mentioned, there's a real life human that is going to be reading your FRQ, and it's easier if you write it in an order that they can find it easily. Although they do read everything you write, including things that are not about psychology. So just try to be nice to them. Okay, the last few things just to keep in mind: defining and applying. You need both. Sometimes it only says you need to apply it, but I want to tell you just straightforward that they oftentimes require that you define the term, even if they don't ask you to. So always give a definition in your own words, and then very, very clearly apply it to the scenario. Don't just define it. When we talk about synonyms, don't use the words that are in the term to define it. So it's true that long-term memory is memory that lasts a long time, but you didn't tell me anything new. So you got to say it in a slightly different way. Long-term memory are things that you remember, things that you can remember for a permanent lifetime. I don't know. Come up with a way to say it that kind of says it in your own words. It's really important that you think of each point as completely separate from all the other points. So when you're applying things, make sure you set the context for each individual little paragraph. Mention the person from the scenario's name in every single paragraph. Make sure you're checking that it's about the right thing. I was looking at a series of them where it depended, some of the scenario was like before an event and some of it was after the event. And for each term, you had to describe if it was before the event during a practice period or after the event, after they found out the result of the event. And if you defined the term right and you applied it to that person, but you didn't apply it to the right time period, you didn't get the point. So just make really, really clear that for every single individual paragraph, you're bringing it really hard into the application. And lastly, if you don't know, it's okay to guess. You don't lose points for making up things. So you either earn it or you don't earn it. And if you don't know, you should just give it a good shot. Obviously, spend the most time on the things that you think that you know, but you can definitely give it a shot if you're not sure. So thank you for listening, and we'll be working on lots of examples in class. Thanks so much.